I'm Dalton Dale, a music enthusiast on a mission to learn about my favorite genre, heavy metal. Join me as I listen through and learn about the history of heavy metal music. We'll be talking about bands, albums, songs, and historical events that helped create the metal music genre as we know it today. This is the Hevolution Podcast. Hey everyone, what's going on? Welcome to this week's edition of the Hevolution Podcast. I am your host, Dalton Dale. Excited to be here. As always, let's get into it. We are rocking our way through the history of heavy metal, and I am entering what I think will make for a great transition period for me personally in my investment in this process. I have shared this before, but typically in my casual listening, I tend to prefer stuff that's I would say a little bit more on the extreme side, especially vocally. Musically, it's maybe not as extreme, but vocally, I prefer more harsh vocals and that sort of thing. And so, more just less traditional heavy metal style and sound. And we are getting ready to kind of make a transition into a subgenre of metal that I think is going to maybe capture my attention a little bit more and give me some of that style and sound that I am maybe a little bit more accustomed to hearing. And so before we make that transition, I just wanted to take some time. Let's break down the little subgenres and genres that we've been through, where we started to where we are now. I've done this before briefly where I've covered, hey, this is where we started. We hit this, and this. But I want to take a moment as a refresher to kind of just say, okay, here are the different things that we've covered, and here's what makes each of those unique and what their major contribution was to the history of heavy metal. So to start with, I went to Black Sabbath, widely agreed upon as the foundation and the basis for heavy metal music. Now, this is because Black Sabbath introduced down-tuned guitars and more darker lyrical content to rock music, we'll say. Coming out of the 60s, the hippie culture was a lot more focused on love and peace. And while those things are really great, there wasn't much in the way of people expressing really deep, dark set emotions, and there was a lot of anti-war music out there, but none of it was dark or doomy or gloomy or even just like more straightforward. A lot of it was very positive, anti-war, sort of pacifist type music. And you had some exceptions, don't get me wrong, but Black Sabbath comes in and you have a factory incident that results in Tony Iommi losing the tips of a couple of his fingers, and he can't pinch the strings as well on the neck for notes, so he downtunes the strings. And if you're not familiar with the guitar and how it works, the tighter you make your strings, the higher the note is. So when you loosen those strings and they get easier to press, they're going down in notes and down in octave. And so that created a much darker and different sound than what most guitarists were doing at the time. Coming out of that, then you hit the mid-70s and you kind of hit this proto-metal era where rock bands start taking inspiration from Sabbath and they start to blend more forward guitar riffs with darker lyrical content. This is a time period where bands really start to kind of experiment and they really start to push the boundaries for what they can write about, how they write their music, and overall song structure. And you see a difference in the actual just typical 60s to early 70s rock into that mid 70s rock play style that borderlines heavy metal or more traditional heavy metal sound. This is bands like AC/DC, Blood Rock, and UFO, and I covered a bunch more back in the early part of this when this was just a TikTok series. Working our way out of the mid 70s, you get into the new wave of British heavy metal. New wave of British heavy metal featured very guitar forward riffs, moving away from more minor blues scales and into more straightforward major chords, while picking up the overall speed of the music and continuing to focus on broader lyrical content such as anti-government, the rock and roll lifestyle, alcohol and drug use, etc. This was a period where I believe the sound of heavy metal was really being refined by bands like Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Motorhead, Def Leppard, just to name a few. This is a period where you got introduced to dual, more layered guitar work. You got introduced to more fast paced double kick drum out of the drummers, specifically from bands like Motorhead. And overall, these bands were really carving out a very specific niche sound for heavy metal. Moving that as heavy metal sort of makes its way into the United States. Up to this point, all of this was happening in the UK. Not to say that nothing was happening in the States, but it was all very, very underground. You know, kids had to work really, really hard to get their hands on anything Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, any of those guys. All of that was happening in the UK. It makes its way to the States. And then what happens is there's a continued focus on refining the sounds from new wave of British heavy metal. There's more distortion on the guitars. And then overall, this sounds counterintuitive, but overall, there was just a cleaner and more polished sound due to the rise of video metal and a more commercial sound. As bands started to get notice in the United States, more and more record labels were signing heavy metal bands because bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest would come to the United States, Black Sabbath, at this point, early 80s, Ozzy Osbourne. Bands were coming to the United States and touring, and they were selling out arenas. It was crazy, and record labels and booking agents everywhere had never seen anything like this out of, we'll just say, rock music as a whole. And then as they started to notice, they started to get more and more bands onto those record labels. And then you had bands like Van Halen and Twisted Sister and Motley Crue kind of rise up through that early American heavy metal sound and continue to polish and hone that traditional heavy metal sound. Now, from there, you get bands that kind of went off into a more commercialized sound with the rise of MTV. And then you have bands that stayed a little more true to what they wanted to be, regardless of the record label, regardless of MTV, and continue to just grind out gigs and play the best heavy metal that they can play. Move that into then power metal. And that's the period we're just coming out of that I just covered, where there's an emphasis on even more creative lyrical content that's very fantasy driven. And there's a further push in the speed of the music and specifically in the guitar riffs and guitar solos. This is bands like Sabotage and Metallica and Accept, all of which that I covered recently in the podcast. And you can go listen to those episodes. But this was a period where it was about continuing to expand the boundaries, continuing to expand the realm of possibility for heavy music as a whole. Heavy metal, really up to now, had already kind of defined itself as a genre, separated itself from just typical rock and roll music, and now it was gaining its own footing and its own place in the music that you hear. And this then created some ruckus, right? You have the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Community, that was headed up by Tipper Gore, that created a whole bunch of issues, a whole wave of problems for, bands that were a little bit edgier, like Judas Priest or Wasp. They even hit major artists like Madonna for, we'll just say, more suggestive content, right? It was more sexual content that was featuring more drug, sex, rock and roll type stuff. And this is just all in the wake. This is all of the battle that really heavy metal music had to go through in order to get to where it goes and to get to where we are today, right? And overall, I would say heavy metal is still it's certainly not the most popular music when you look at the broad population, but it is way less underground than it used to be. And obviously with the advent of music streaming and social media, it's a lot more accessible than it used to be. But these are just some of the early stages of heavy metal and the things that it had to go through in order for us to get to where we are. Now, as we work out of power metal, we're going to make our transition into black metal. Now, with black metal, This was something that kind of really got its birth in the early 80s. Black metal was, there's a little bit of back and forth about where really the birth of the specific black metal subgenre came from. And I'll talk about that a little bit here. But first, I want to kind of touch on what makes black metal unique, what makes black metal black metal. There was a very concentrated effort to make music that was extremely low production quality. It was sort of removed from the professionalism of more commercial heavy metal of the time, and it was extremely anti-Christian. The music itself is characterized by very simplistic play styles that are stripped of all the typical like glamour and flash that accompanied most popular heavy metal styles of the period. The vocals are a lot more raw and less polished than the vocalists of the time. So, this isn't like your Rob Halfords and your Bruce Dickinsons and those like that. This is going to be more akin to like Lemmy and Hetfield and just that rougher, gruffer sound and style that comes out of that. And then you kind of combine that a little bit with like King Diamond from Merciful Fate, who's a little shriekier and has more of an emphasis on that high-pitched, shrieky vocal quality. And all of those are factors to what makes black metal, gives black metal its specific sound, along with the drum work that's typically fast with a lot of double bass work. And then the bass guitar really plays into the lower end to match the footwork of the drummer and gives a lot further depth to the lower tones of the guitar. The focus was on creating a sound that was a bit unnerving. It was a focus on creating a sound that was much darker in its overall sound and style. And in order to do that, they had to layer their music a little bit differently. And then they had to kind of strip away all of the extra stuff, extra fluff, we'll call it, that came along with the rise of new wave of British heavy metal, commercial, and video metal of the early 80s. And that is really the biggest thing for black metal is how do we get to very rudimentary play styles? How do we play things that are a lot easier to digest and that remove all, when you're talking like a drummer, taking out all the extra drum fills, taking out, I don't need 12 different drums and 14 different cymbals. I need like 3 or 4 drums and a cymbal, so there was a very big focus on simplistic play styles. For, the guitarist, it's, I'm not doing guitar solos. This isn't about me flashing my guitar. This is just about pure straight up riffage, right? And then the bass guitar, you're not having these crazy bass walks and bass lines up underneath everything. They are really just matching the tone and the pace of the drums and then kind of sitting back into that heavier sound that comes out of the lower notes of the guitar. So that is really what makes black metal unique, is its overall sound and style. And then obviously there's the theme that comes along with black metal, as most, if not all, black metal bands are very anti-Christian and satanic in their nature and in their lyrical content. And I think that is a big part of what lends heavy metal as a whole to that big picture. Like, there's a lot of ruckus around, oh, heavy metal is by nature, it's satanic, it's it's all of the devil. And it's not. It's really not. In fact, the band that we're talking about today, it's shock value. If you go and you talk to some of the bands that are doing it at a high level and that were doing it for a very long time, they believe in Satan as much as they believe in God, which is not at all. So it's not even so much that they're, pro Satan or anything like that, as much as it's a shock value, it's a shock factor sort of thing. And then that sort of kind of accompanied itself along with a lot of other bands and a lot of other play styles. But I'm going to be covering bands from the early wave of black metal like Venom, Bathory, Hellhammer, Slayer, Morbid Angel, just to name a few. And this era is going to take us up through the mid 80s, 86, 87 or thereabouts. And then I'll kind of turn around a bit and we'll go back and we'll visit some mid 80s speed and thrash metal. All of this is really, really critical because, as I mentioned a lot in the power metal section, I feel like that was definitely the branching point for heavy metal in developing. At that point, heavy metal had its own sound, it had its own style, it had its own a lot of things, right? And I feel like that once you get to that point, everything kind of starts branching, and you have all these different bands that kind of pick and pull these different parts of all this different music that's out now. There's a much, there's not a huge, but a lot more of a catalog to digest from. And then they end up adding their own stuff to it and creating their own sounds and styles. So today we're going to be covering Venom's second album, Black Metal. Released in 1982, this album ended up giving the subgenre its name, and it laid the foundation for many of the sounds and styles for black metal and other extreme metal genres that follow. So, I'm going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with some quick hits, and I'll talk a little bit about Black Metal, the album. Hey everyone, just wanted to take a quick moment and just remind you about the Hevolution podcast playlist that I've got on Spotify. I've mentioned this in a few episodes before, but I just want to give a fresh reminder for any new listeners out there. If you head over to Spotify, you can just search for my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and I've got a customized playlist called the Hevolution podcast playlist, and it is filled with everything that I listen to for this podcast. It goes all the way back to when I started this out as just a TikTok page and runs it all the way through to this week's episode. So be sure to go check that out. You can follow it there. Again, just find my personal profile, Dalton A. Dale, and find my playlist, the Hevolution podcast playlist, and you can follow along. We will get you right back to the episode. All right, welcome back. Those of you watching, I'm trying out a new camera angle this week. Let me know what you think. Hit me up on socials and tell me. I thought maybe there's a little bit of light, some greenery. Maybe it's a little more interesting than my fireplace. But let's jump into some quick hits, and then we'll get into the album. So quick hit number 1, the original members of the band all went by nicknames or character names. And this has actually stayed true through the entire existence of the band. I'm going to focus on the original members. Jeffrey Dunn went by Mantis, and he played guitar. Conrad Lant went by Kronos, and he did vocals and bass. And Anthony Bray went by Abaddon, who played the drums. This was just a creative decision made at the birth of the band. I didn't find much as to why, but I did find it interesting. This is probably one of the earliest times or moments with a band that I have heard of them taking on unique characters for their band. And so I thought that was pretty interesting and unique to Venom. Number 2, I mentioned this in kind of my covering of black metal, the genre, but while the band's lyrics are all mostly focused on Satan, the band chose the theme for shock value and have always insisted that they were really not big believers in the content directly. This was another creative decision made out of the gate that was really driven by the band's desire to create music and to have a stage performance and to have a sound and style that really gave an uneasy feeling and just create shock value. I think at this point, there are a lot of bands doing heavy metal. Heavy metal was at its rise, and so it was easy for bands to kind of come in and say, I'm going to do that, A, because I like it, and B, maybe I'll see some success out of it. And then you get to a point with anything new like that, I feel like you get to a point where you've got to kind of do something that sets yourself apart, right? You've got to come up with something that really, sets you apart from everything else and grabs the attention of the people that you're trying to attract. And I think this was part of that decision. I think that the lyrical content and the theme of Black Metal, the album, as well as what the band chooses to write about from here forward, it became what it was as a means to say, here we are, this is who we are, this is what we want to be, and this is the sound that we're going for. Quick hit number 3, the album features a few DIY sound effects that are pretty unique for the period and showcase Kronos' ability to produce and his knowledge on the studio side of things. When you go read about this record, the first record they had a lot of help, and then the second record, Kronos really helped a lot with refining the sound and really making sure that the band stuck true to what they were looking to accomplish in the studio and had a lot of input on the overall production of the album. And so for the opening of the title track, there's this really weird sound that happens at the very beginning. And if until I was reading more into the album, as I was listening through the album, I couldn't tell what it was. But they actually brought a chainsaw into the studio and they ran it against like some sheet metal and to create this sort of sawing noise, and it results in this really unsettling sort of grinding noise. And I thought that was kind of an interesting, again, it's DIY, right? They literally brought this chainsaw in, put some mics up close, and then apparently they even grinded the teeth off the chainsaw. So I mean, that's the kind of process that they went through just to get this sound. It literally happens for maybe 10 to 15 seconds at the opening of the album. For the song Buried Alive, they wanted the sound of a coffin being buried. So they brought in cardboard boxes, put microphones in them, and then they began to shovel mud on top of the cardboard to get that sound. And, when you're listening to the track, I got to hand it to them. It really sounds like someone being buried. It was very impressive, right? When you think about, you're all analog recording. You don't just have all these plugged in sound effects that you can just hit a button and say, give me this sound, or even combine digital sounds to really give you a particular sound. They just had to go make it. And so I thought that that was really cool. It's very DIY, and very stylistically representative of, I think, what black metal was fundamentally about, which was, again, just that raw sound, that very simplistic, rudimentary, sound and style. But let's get into the album and talk a little bit about, a few specific songs. As always, go listen to it. I'm not going to cover everything from the album. In fact, today I'm only covering a few tracks, just namely because of the length of the episode. But the black metal album, it exists at the intersection of like Black Sabbath, Motorhead, and late 70s hardcore punk, and then the occult. Like, it is such a crazy amalgamation of sounds and styles that you can hear the influence of all of those different things at any given point in the album. I promise you, turn it on, you'll hear Black Sabbath riffs, you will hear Motorhead drums, you will hear hardcore punk vocals and vocal styles, and all of the themes are all very satanic and occult. There's just more dissonant sounding guitar chords, heavy riffs, deep growling vocals, very groovy bass lines, and some very quick double bass work. I mean, Venom really created a blend of genres and just added a punch of satanic darkness that created the foundation for black metal and other extreme metal subgenres that followed, as I mentioned before. The title track, Black Metal, it comes out swinging. It is a blazing fast drum beat, very equally paced guitars, and that sets the tone for the album very quickly. You can immediately hear that influence of Motorhead and that underground punk music that came out of the late 70s. Buried Alive, it's got some bass lines and a guitar solo that really could just be dropped like right into one of the first few Black Sabbath albums. There's definite inspiration there when you listen to that and you compare that with like Black Sabbath self-titled or even Paranoid. And then there's just a slight groove to that dark track, and it's about someone experiencing death, as I mentioned before. It's got that cardboard, where they're burying mud into the cardboard to make it sound like somebody getting buried. So again, just dark themes, right? Then that rolls right into Raise the Dead, which has a more upbeat, groovy guitar riff. And again, a transition from Buried Alive into Raise the Dead that seems very inspired by Black Sabbath. It's really easy to hear how heavily influenced by early heavy metal and new wave of British heavy metal Venom was. I mean, these two songs alone, I think, showcase that specific sound and those specific influences really, really well, and end up, again, just creating, putting their own spin and creating some different sounds and unique styles even within those that, again, help continue to define the genres after this. But those two songs, Buried Alive and Raise the Dead, they were actually originally demos to the first album, but the band didn't quite feel like they could do them justice by recording them at that point in studio. And so they ended up just reworking parts of the songs and then put them together on this album. They reworked the ending of Buried Alive so that it transitioned into Raise the Dead, and it does very, very well. Again, much in the way that early Black Sabbath was doing on some of their stuff. The song Teacher's Pet, by far, probably one of the weirder songs on the album. It has nothing to do with Satan. Um, I'll just say it's about a boy's fantasy and his teacher. You can go look it up yourself, but just, be warned. It's got this blues segment that happens at the 1 minute 16-second mark of the song. You transition away from the early part of the song where everything is really fast paced and riffier into a straight up blues riff, and that blues riff and groove, it goes all the way through to the 2 minute 50-second mark. So you're talking nearly 2 minutes of blues track, like, and there's very little vocals. It's some talking, and it's just kind of unusual when you go read what the song is about. I think that this was a stylistic choice for how the timing of that lines up with lyrically what's happening in the song at that point. Again, I'll let you go look it up, but it's a transition from, a boy being caught doing something to, okay, teacher, see me after class kind of vibes, and then blues. And you get that for a couple of minutes, and then it goes back into that earlier riff and everything. But in my opinion, and the reason I wanted to call this out, this is a real showcase of the band's level of musicianship. And I think while black metal inherently is more simplistic and rudimentary in its playstyle, I think that there is still a desire that comes pretty innately to most musicians to be versatile and to showcase your different abilities in different ways. And artists choose to do that very differently. In this case, it's a more cohesive decision as a unit to play a play style that is not at all what they play and to do it really well. It's a pretty solid blues section. So make sure to go check that out and listen for that. But it's, there's about 10 or 11 songs on the album. It's got, if you go listen to the version I listened to, which is on Spotify, I added that to the Hevolution playlist, Hevolution podcast playlist. There's a lot of extra tracks on it that feature different demos as well as I think a live recording or two. So it's got a lot. Overall, I think black metal makes the album makes an extremely excellent case for being the birth of the genre. And it lent its name, the album lent its name to the subgenre for a reason. And a lot of people will argue that Merciful Fate kind of holds the title for birthing black metal because of their very strong occult themes in their music. But and then even some bands after Venom, that people will attribute to say, okay, no, they did it first. But really, honestly, I think that this album does lay enough groundwork to earn its keep in that regard. I think that there's so many aspects to black metal playstyle, black metal lyrical content, as well as black metal sound that uh, are represented in this album that really had not been this fully represented or imagined in any other album to this point, that I think can cement its place as the birth of the early wave of black metal. So overall, it was a very interesting listen, continuing to push me out of my box a little bit in terms of what I listen to casually, but we're getting into more extreme styles of heavy metal, and that interests me a lot more than some of the stuff that I've covered so far. So, not to disregard or downplay the importance of a lot of that. It's again getting to the point where now I'm able to kind of connect the dots through time, and I'm able to hear different things that are going to continue to translate really well as we move forward. And I really am seeing this more in a full picture in terms of even up to new songs that drop today. That I really am able to kind of see this full picture and kind of start to understand how we evolved from something like a Black Sabbath up to a Whitechapel, up to a Slipknot, up to you know uh, all these other bands that are doing it at a high level these days. So, thank you for checking out this podcast, thank you for listening to today's episode about black metal. And we will continue grinding this out, and I will continue sharing my process with you. And I hope that you find it valuable. I hope that you're finding it as valuable as I am finding it, to just really learn and understand this. And then as well, just document this in a different medium, in a different format than a book or something like that. So make sure you go check out the Evolution podcast playlist on Spotify. It's got every album of everything that I've listened to and I've covered from my TikTok series up to now. Go find me on socials. You can find me on Facebook, the Evolution Podcast. Follow me there. And then you can find me on TikTok at the Evolution Pod. You can also send me an email, evolutionpodcast@gmail.com. As well, leave a 5-star review. It's super, super helpful for podcasts that are just getting started out, and I would greatly appreciate it. I thank you all for your time. I thank you all for listening, and I thank you all for all of your support. I hope you have a great week. We will see you next time.